Thank you very much. And I say this hall is totally full. It looks great, and coming in here, seeing all the people in the street outside and the general atmosphere, what a great feeling, what a great conference, what a great movement, what a great start to the campaign, and what great news today from Dublin of those 100,000 people on the streets of Dublin protesting against the cuts. To understand the situation we're in, we need to think a little globally and try and understand the history we're in. I'm sure some in this room would have read or heard of or seen summaries of that wonderful book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine, because that is what we're in the middle of at the present time. In her book, which is a devastating critique of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and now the European Central Bank, which has taken on its mantle of those two or other organisations, she describes how the shock doctrine was meted out on the economies of third world countries. An unsustainable debt was built up because of high oil prices, high interest rates, and unfair trade practices by richer nations. The shock doctrine was that those countries had got to realise their position in the world, had to accept the IMF's loan and bailout, which in every case involved lowering corporation taxation, raising income tax, privatising public services, creating greater levels of unemployment, selling off state assets, turning farming over to multinational corporations, and the result you can see around the capital city in every African country today. Very rich people living in some of the most exclusive suburbs, millions of poor people living in shanty towns around those cities, and land taken over by agribusiness to decide how it's going to run those economies. That was the shock doctrine. They were told to forget about the ideas of a welfare state, forget about the ideas of a national health service, forget about the ideas of free university education, all those dreams that were there at the time of independence of those countries. Now, what's happening in Europe is very, very interesting, because the economic doctrine that has been forced upon European countries is not that different. And the tactics employed by the IMF and the World Bank and now the European Central Bank are not that different. Some of you would remember the debt crisis of the 1980s that affected Latin American countries. There was a unity for a short time of all Latin American countries saying the debt is unsustainable and unpayable, we will not pay it. Very quickly, they moved in and split the countries off one by one. Individual deals were done between the USA and particular governments. The IMF did deals, and they were divided off and split off. And then the privatisation took place, and then the destruction of public services took place. In countries where there was a fight back, things have turned out historically very different. Hence the very progressive governments in Venezuela and Bolivia today, where people stood up against privatisation and what went with it. And what we now see in Europe is the way in which there's been media and cultural denigration of one country after the other. Remember all the stories that appeared in the Mail and the Telegraph, CNN and Fox News and all this about the allegedly lazy Greek people, about the allegedly work-shy people in Greece, about the allegedly burgeoning welfare state, bloated public service, etc., etc., as a great excuse for forcing a loan and forcing those massive cuts, unemployment, and greater division between the rich and poor in Greece. They thought they got away with it there. I'm not so sure that they have. They've done the same with a tax on Spain, the same with a tax on Ireland at the present time, and the same with a tax on Portugal. A week ago, I was in Lisbon for the NATO summit. No, don't get worried, I wasn't invited to the NATO summit. I wasn't advising the leaders about anything. I was at a parallel peace conference. And there was something utterly surreal about the atmosphere in Lisbon. You had the NATO leaders planning a new generation of nuclear weapons, planning at least another 5 years occupation of Afghanistan, and planning what they called reasonable, i.e. very high levels of defence expenditure by each member state. And they were all going along with it, and there was a whole retinue of arms manufacturers and lobbyists and so on surrounding that summit. And then, on the streets of Lisbon, there were posters and signs everywhere calling for support for the general strike on Wednesday, against the austerity package and against the cuts. What can be more obscene than cutting health and social expenditure while building a new generation of nuclear weapons and continuing a war in Afghanistan and Iraq? And so we are faced now with a situation in this country where the government is bringing in a shock doctrine. And what I would say in finality is this. We have campaigns on every single issue. We have campaigns on libraries, we have campaigns on hospitals, campaigns on every element of public service. Remember two things. One is defend the principle of the welfare state, the free health service, the idea that there is unemployment benefit in education and housing available for all. Lose that principle at our peril, and we end up with a nasty, divided, market-driven society and economy, even worse than we have at the present time. But also recognise where they're getting rattled. The students have shown the way. Yes, with opposition to 300% fee increases, but also opposition to the cut in education maintenance allowance, which will remove the opportunity for university education for a whole generation of working class kids. In Parliament this week, they were very rattled by the student demonstrations the week before and this week. They're very rattled at the opposition to these things that are coming on already. There's a debate this week on the fees. More importantly, there's going to be a vote sometime ahead of Christmas on the new fees and university funding package. I say people should be taxed by their wealth, not by their learning, that student fees should not go up, and that we should force those Liberal Democrat MPs that all signed that non-fees pledge before the election to stand by their word or get out of the way. Because if we win on the student fees, we can win on everything else. Thank you very much.